The Galactic Concord officer who stepped out of the ship was like nothing Yuna had ever imagined. She was tall and elegant with scales that shifted between green and blue depending on the angle of the light. And her eyes held an ancient wisdom that seemed to look right through to the truth of things. Her name was Valenis, and she served as an investigator for the Concord's Justice Division. Behind her came 4 more officers of different species, each one carrying themselves with the calm authority of beings who enforce law across the stars. Valenis surveyed the scene before her with those knowing eyes, taking in the gathered townspeople and the cowering Corvith and the small group of defenders who stood between the hunter and its prey. She spoke in a voice that was musical but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Stand down," Valenis said to the Corvith in perfect human language. "Your hunting license has been suspended pending investigation." The Corvith protested in its grinding language, the translator struggling to keep up with its rapid speech. "We have legal documentation," the machine voice said. "The Valorian is registered property of the Syndicate." Valenis made a gesture, and one of her officers projected a holographic display that showed documents and images and lines of alien text. "Your documentation is forged," Valenis said with cold certainty. "We have been tracking this particular slave ship for months. The Corvus Syndicate does not have legal authority to capture and sell Valorians. Your operation is criminal, and your presence on this Concord-protected world is a violation of 17 different statutes." The Corvith hunter seemed to shrink under the weight of Valenis's words, its forearms lowering to its sides in defeat. More Concord ships were arriving now, their lights visible through the trees as they descended on the crashed slave vessel. In the mountains, the other Corvith from the town were being rounded up along with their human accomplice who turned out to be a wanted criminal himself. Valenis approached Sathara with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the steel she had shown the Corvith. She spoke in Valorian, soft flowing words that made Sethra's patterns flare with sudden hope. Then she turned to Yuna and knelt down so that she was at eye level with the human girl. Valenis's scales shifted to a warm golden color as she studied Yuna's face. "We received an anonymous transmission from this region 3 days ago," Valenis said. "It contained coordinates for the crashed slave ship and information about escaped captives in danger. We came as quickly as we could, but we were almost too late." She paused and her head tilted slightly to one side. "Our analysts traced the transmission to a computer terminal registered to this farm. Would you know anything about that?" Young one Yuna felt her face flush with heat because she had sent that message on the 3rd night after finding Sathara, hoping desperately that someone in the galaxy might care enough to help. She had not known if it would reach anyone or if anyone would believe her. "I had to try," Yuna said quietly. "I did not know what else to do." Valenis reached out and placed a scaled hand on Yuna's shoulder, and the touch was surprisingly warm. "What you did was extraordinarily brave," Valenis said. "Most beings would have looked away and pretended not to see. You chose to help a stranger from another world at great risk to yourself and your family. That is not a common thing, not even among species who have traveled the stars for millennia." Sathara stepped forward and spoke to Valenis in rapid Valorian, gesturing toward Yuna and Yunji. When she finished, Valenis nodded slowly, and her scale shifted to an even deeper gold. "Sathara wishes to perform the ritual of eternal bond," Valenis explained. "It is the highest honor a Valorian can bestow upon another being. She wishes to declare you and your grandmother as her family, bound by ties that transcend distance and time." Yuna looked at Sathara, who was crying now, silver tears running down her gray cheeks and her patterns glowing brighter than Yuna had ever seen them. The alien mother reached out and took Yuna's hand, then reached for Yunji's hand with her other. She pressed both their hands against her chest where her heart beat strong and steady. Then she spoke in careful human words that she had practiced in secret for this moment. "My heart is your heart." Sithara said, "My family is your family." Now and forever across all the stars, Yuna could not speak through her own tears. So she simply squeezed Sethra's hand and hoped that the gesture said everything she could not put into words. The townspeople watched in silence as the ritual completed, many of them wiping their own eyes at the sight of such raw emotion between beings from different worlds. Old Mr. Jang cleared his throat loudly and announced that everyone should come back to town for hot food and warm beds. It was a very human response to an extraordinary situation, practical and kind, and exactly what everyone needed. In the days that followed, the Galactic Concord worked to dismantle the Corvus slave operation and free all the captured Valorians. Sithara provided testimony that helped the investigators track down other syndicate operations across the sector. Her courage in speaking out, combined with Yuna's transmission and the evidence from the crash ship, dealt a major blow to the illegal trade in Valorian captives. Valanis offered Sithara the choice to return to her homeworld or to stay on Earth under Concord protection. Sithara chose to stay, at least for now, because she had found something precious on this small blue planet that she had not expected to find. She had found a family that loved her not for what she could give them, but simply because she existed. The Concord helped Dunji expand the farmhouse with technology that seemed like magic, adding rooms that were bigger on the inside than they appeared from outside. Sithara and Mirith had their own space now, but they spent most of their time in the main house with Yuna and her grandmother. Mirith emerged from her pod on a spring morning when the cherry blossoms were blooming in the orchard. She was tiny and perfect, with silver patterns that glowed pink when she was happy, which was most of the time. Yuna became her teacher, showing her how to walk on the soft grass of the garden and how to say words in both human and Valorian. Sithara became an ambassador of sorts for Valorian refugees, working with the Concord to help others who had been displaced by the slave trade. Her bioluminescent patterns now blazed with vibrant colors that lit up the farmhouse at night. Like a galaxy captured in living form, she never forgot what she owed to the young human girl who had found her starving in an abandoned cabin, and she never stopped being amazed by the capacity for compassion that existed in beings who had only just learned they were not alone. In the universe, Yunji lived to see Yuna grow into a young woman who became an advocate for interspecies relations. She often told the story of the farmer who saved her family during the war, adding that kindness was a light that passed from one heart to another across generations. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, 4 figures sat on the farmhouse porch watching the stars appear. An old woman and a young woman and an alien mother and a child who belonged to 2 worlds at once. They did not speak, because no words were needed. The light of Sethra's patterns mingled with the light of the emerging stars, and Mirith laughed and pointed at the sky with wonder in her eyes. Somewhere out there among those countless points of light were worlds that Yuna might someday visit, but for now she was content to sit with her family, human and alien, bound together by choices made in the dark of a forest when everything was uncertain. The galaxy had learned something important from this small story on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star. It had learned that humanity measured its worth not in technology or power or conquest. It measured its worth in the simple act of a child offering her lunch to a stranger, and that, perhaps, was the most extraordinary thing of all. The Corvith arrived in town on a gray morning when rain was falling softly from clouds that hung low over the mountains. Yuna was at the market with her grandmother buying vegetables when she first saw them, and the sight made her blood run cold. There were 3 of them, each standing nearly 7 feet tall with 4 arms and skin the color of dried blood. Their faces were flat and wide with small dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, missing nothing and showing no mercy. They wore uniforms that looked official and carried devices that blinked with lights and made soft beeping sounds. A 4th figure walked with them, a human man in a suit who introduced himself to the gathered townspeople as a representative of Galactic Affairs. These are licensed bounty hunters from the Corvith Syndicate. The man announced in a voice that was polished and professional. They are searching for a dangerous criminal who escaped from a transport vessel that crashed in this region 3 weeks ago. The criminal is a Valorian female who may be carrying stolen Syndicate property. Anyone with information about her whereabouts should report it immediately. Yuna felt her grandmother's hand tighten on her shoulder, a silent warning to keep her face calm and her mouth shut. She watched the Corvith spread out through the market, showing a holographic image of Sithara to the shopkeepers and farmers. The image showed Sithara as she must have looked before her capture, her skin glowing with vibrant patterns and her eyes full of life instead of fear. Several people shook their heads and said they had seen nothing unusual, but Yuna noticed how the Corvith watched everyone's reactions with those cold, unblinking eyes. They were looking for any sign of nervousness, any hint that someone might be hiding something. Yunji steered Yuna away from the market and back toward the farm, walking at a pace that was quick but not so fast as to attract attention. "We must move Sethara tonight," Yunji said quietly once they were out of earshot of the town. "There is an old mine shaft in the mountains where your grandfather used to explore when he was young. It is hidden well and the Corvith will not know to look there." Yuna nodded, but her mind was racing with fear and desperate plans. The Corvith had technology and numbers and the authority of that official-looking human in the suit. All they had was an old farmhouse and a hidden cellar that would not stay hidden for long if the hunters decided to search. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the move, packing food and blankets and medical supplies into bags that they could carry through the forest. Sithara was stronger now, but still not fully recovered, and the journey to the mine shaft would take several hours through rough terrain. When darkness fell, they helped Sithara out of the cellar and began the long walk into the mountains. Mirith's pod was strapped to Sethra's chest, and the baby seemed to sense the tension because she stayed quiet and still throughout the journey. The forest was full of sounds that made Yuna jump at every shadow, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the Corvith could hear it from miles away. They were halfway to the mine shaft when a light suddenly blazed through the trees ahead of them. Yuna grabbed her grandmother's arm, and they all froze, pressing themselves against the trunk of an enormous pine tree. A figure stepped out of the darkness, and Yuna had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming. It was a Corvith scout, smaller than the one she had seen in town, but no less terrifying. The hunter's 4 arms held various devices and weapons, and its eyes reflected the light from its own equipment like the eyes of a predator in the dark. The Corvith spoke in a language that sounded like grinding stones, and a device on its belt translated the words into flat mechanical human speech Valorian female detected. The translator said, "Surrender the property, and you will not be harmed property." Yuna thought with a surge of anger that burned away some of her fear. Sethara was not property, and neither was Mirith, and she would not let these monsters take them. Sethara stepped forward with her head held high despite her weakness and her patterns flickering with pale light. She placed herself between the Corvith and the humans, shielding Yuna and Yunji with her own body. Yuna heard her speak in Valorian, words that were soft but carried a weight of dignity that made the translator pause before rendering them in human language. "I will go with you," Sethara said through the machine. But you will leave these humans alone, and you will not take my daughter." The Corvith made a sound that might have been laughter, harsh and cruel and utterly without warmth. "The offspring is valuable merchandise," the translator said. "Perhaps more valuable than you, since it is young and undamaged." Sethra's patterns flared with sudden brightness. Blue and silver and gold, all swirling together in a display of emotion that Yuna had never seen before. It was rage and despair and fierce maternal love all burning together like a star about to explode, but before Sithara could speak or act, Yuna stepped out from behind the tree and stood beside her. The Corvith's small eyes focused on the human child with surprise and something that might have been amusement. "Move aside, little creature," the translator said. "This does not concern your species." Yuna's voice shook, but she forced the words out anyway. "She is under my protection," Yuna said, "and you cannot have her." The Corvith tilted its head in a gesture that looked almost curious. "Your protection means nothing," the translator responded. "You are small and weak, and you have no authority here." But Yuna stood her ground even though her knees were trembling and her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst. She remembered what her grandmother had told her about the farmer who saved her family all those years ago. He had been just one person against a whole war, and he had chosen to help anyway because it was the right thing to do. "I am a human being," Yuna said with more strength in her voice now. "And on this planet that means something, you are not welcome here, and you will not take this mother from her child." Yunji moved to stand on Sethra's other side, and then the three of them formed a line facing the Corvith hunter, an old woman and a young girl and a weakened alien mother, standing together against a monster in the dark forest. The Corvith raised one of its four arms, and Yuna saw the gleam of a weapon powering up. Then a new sound echoed through the trees, voices calling out in Korean, and the crash of many feet through the underbrush. Lights appeared from multiple directions, flashlights and lanterns carried by dozens of people from the town. At the front of the group was old Mr. Jang from the hardware store, carrying a hunting rifle that looked older than Yuna. Behind him came the Kim family from the farm down the road, and the Park sisters who ran the noodle shop, and the young mail carrier, whose name Yuna could never remember. They had come because Yunji had called them before leaving the house, telling them that something terrible was happening in the mountains and that they needed help. The Corvith looked at the gathering crowd and calculated the odds with cold precision. It could probably defeat these humans easily, but the noise and the chaos would attract attention from the authorities. And there was something in the way these humans were looking at the alien mother, something protective and fierce that made the hunter uncertain before anything else could happen. A new light descended from the sky above the trees. It was a ship, but not a Corvith vessel. This one bore the markings of the Galactic Concorde, and it settled into a clearing nearby with a hum of advanced engines. Yuna watched as a door opened and a figure emerged, tall and graceful with iridescent scales that shimmered in the ship's lights. Help had arrived from the stars. Yunji was waiting for Yuna at the kitchen table the next morning, with a look on her weathered face that made Yuna's heart sink into her stomach. The old woman's eyes were sharp despite her 72 years, and they missed very little that happened on her farm. She gestured for Yuna to sit down across from her and poured 2 cups of tea with steady hands that had seen decades of hard work. "I know you have been taking food into the forest," Yunji said in a voice that was calm but left no room for lies. "I know you have been sneaking out every afternoon and coming home with mud on your shoes and secrets in your eyes." Yuna felt tears spring to her eyes because she had never been good at hiding things from her grandmother. She opened her mouth to explain, to apologize, to beg for understanding, but the words got stuck in her throat like a ball of rice. Yunji waited with the patience of a woman who had raised 3 children and buried a husband and survived hardships that Yuna could not even imagine. Finally, Yuna found her voice and the whole Story came pouring out like water breaking through a dam. She told her grandmother about finding Sithara in the cabin, about the starving alien mother and the baby in the pod. She told her about the Corvith, and the slave ship and the terrible trade in Valorian skin. She told her about teaching Sithara human words and learning Valorian words in return, and she told her about the gesture of connected hearts and what it meant to be trusted by someone from another world. When Yuna finished speaking, she could not bring herself to look at her grandmother's face. She stared at her own hands wrapped around the warm teacup and waited for anger or disappointment or fear. But the sound that came from Yunji was none of those things. It was a long, slow breath that seemed to carry years of memory and pain and wisdom all at once. Yuna looked up and saw tears in her grandmother's eyes, which shocked her because Yunji almost never cried. "Bring them here," Yunji said in a voice that trembled slightly but held no doubt. "Bring the mother and her child to this house right now, before the sun gets any higher." Yuna stared at her grandmother in disbelief, because this was not the reaction she had expected. "You are not angry with me?" she asked in a small voice. Yunji reached across the table and took Yuna's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her age. "Let me tell you a story," Yunji said. "A story I have never told you before. Many years ago, when I was just a little older than you are now, there was a terrible war in our country. My family had to flee our home with nothing but the clothes on our backs, and we walked for days through mountains and forests to escape the fighting. We were starving and exhausted, and my mother was sick with a fever that burned so hot I thought it would kill her one night. We came upon a farmhouse in a valley, and we were so desperate that we collapsed at the door and begged for help. The farmer who lived there had every reason to turn us away because harboring refugees was dangerous and there was barely enough food for his own family, but he took us in anyway and hid us in his cellar for 3 weeks while my mother recovered. He shared his food with us, even though it meant his own children went hungry some nights. And when it was finally safe to travel again, he gave us directions to a camp where we could find shelter." Yunji paused and wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "That farmer saved our lives," she continued, "and I swore that if I ever had the chance to do the same for someone else, I would not hesitate. It does not matter to me that your friend is from another world. She's a mother protecting her child, and that is something I understand better than almost anything." Yuna threw herself into her grandmother's arms and hugged her so tightly that Yunji laughed despite the tears. Together they walked through the forest to the old cabin where Sithara waited. The alien mother tensed when she saw Yunji, her weakened body trying to shield Mirith even though she could barely stand. But Yuna spoke quickly in the Valorian words she had learned, saying friend and safe and family. Yunji bowed low in the way of her ancestors, a gesture of deep respect that needed no translation. Then she held out her hands to Sithara with her palms facing up, showing that she carried no weapons and meant no harm. Sithara looked at Yuna, who nodded and smiled through her tears. The alien mother slowly placed her hands in Yunji's, and something passed between the two women that went beyond words or species. It was an understanding between mothers, a recognition of shared strength and shared fear and shared hope for their children. They helped Sithara walk back to the farmhouse, supporting her between them because she was too weak to make the journey alone. Yunji had already prepared the old cellar beneath the kitchen, clearing out the storage boxes and laying down blankets and cushions. To make a soft bed, it was not a perfect hiding place, but it was warm and dry and hidden from anyone who might come looking over the next several days. Sithara began to recover under Yunji's expert care. The old woman had raised chickens and goats her whole life, And she applied the same practical wisdom to nursing an alien back to health. She experimented with different foods and discovered that fermented vegetables seemed to give Sithara more strength than anything else. She boiled herbs and roots into teas that helped Sithara sleep through the night without waking in terror. And she sat with Sithara for hours, communicating through gestures and drawings and the universal language of kindness. Yuna watched her grandmother with new eyes, seeing for the first time the depth of courage and compassion that lived in the old woman's heart. Sethra's bioluminescent patterns began to glow again, faintly at first but growing stronger each day. Soft swirls of blue and silver would light up her skin when she was happy or feeling strong. And when she looked at Yuna and Yunji, her patterns would pulse with a warm golden color that meant love and gratitude in Valorian. But the danger had not passed, and everyone knew it. Strange ships continued to appear over the mountains, and the news reported that unusual beings had been spotted in towns not far from their own. The Corvith were still searching, and they were getting closer every day. One evening, as the three of them sat in the cellar watching Mirith sleep in her pod, Sithara drew a picture in a small notebook that Yunji had given her. It showed a Corvith figure, tall and broad, with 4 arms, and a face that looked like a nightmare made solid. Beneath the drawing, Sithara wrote a single word in shaky human letters that she had been practicing hunters. Yuna and Yunji exchanged a look that held no words but spoke volumes. The hunters were coming, and they would have to be ready to face them. For the next 7 days, Yuna lived a double life that tested every bit of cleverness she possessed. In the mornings, she would help her grandmother Yunji with the farm chores, feeding the chickens and watering the vegetable garden and pretending that everything was completely normal. But every afternoon when Yunji took her daily nap, Yuna would slip away into the forest with a bag full of food hidden under her jacket. The alien mother, who Yuna had started calling Star in her own mind because she did not know her real name, was slowly beginning to trust her. On the second day, Star had not flinched when Yuna entered the cabin, and by the 4th day, she was reaching for the food without hesitation. But there was a problem that Yuna had not expected when she first decided to help. Not everything she brought was good for Star to eat. The fish made Star violently sick, and Yuna had to watch helplessly as the alien vomited into the corner of the cabin while clutching her baby clothes. The next day, Yuna brought only rice and vegetables, and Star ate them without any trouble. Bread seemed fine, but anything with meat caused the same terrible reaction. Yuna began to understand that Star's body worked differently from a human body, processing food in ways that she could not begin to comprehend. At night, when her grandmother was asleep, Yuna would sneak to the old computer terminal in the living room and search for information about alien biology. The Galactic Concord had shared some basic facts about the different species in their union, and Yuna read everything she could find. She learned about the Valorians, a species known for their tall, thin bodies and the bioluminescent patterns on their skin that could glow in beautiful colors. The picture she found showed Valorians with skin that shimmered like starlight, covered in swirling patterns of blue and purple and gold. Star's patterns were dark and lifeless, and Yuna now understood that this was a sign of severe malnutrition and distress. Valorians needed specific plant compounds to survive, things that their own world provided in abundance, but that were rare on Earth. Yuna made a list of foods that might contain similar nutrients, and began experimenting with what she brought. To the cabin, sweet potatoes seemed to help more than regular rice, and leafy green vegetables made Star's patterns flicker with the faintest hint of light. By the 6th day, Yuna and Star had developed a way of communicating through gestures and simple drawings in the dirt floor of the cabin. Yuna learned that Star's real name was Sithara, and that the baby in the pod was called Mirith. The pod was a Valorian birthing container that protected infants during their first months of life, keeping them safe and warm until they were strong enough to survive outside. Sithara drew pictures that told a story more terrible than anything Yuna had imagined. She had been captured by creatures called the Corvith, a species that hunted Valorians for their bioluminescent skin. Corvith could harvest the glowing patterns and sell them to wealthy collectors across the galaxy as decorations and status symbols. Sithara had been on a slave ship with dozens of other Valorians when the ship crashed. Somewhere in the mountains nearby, she had escaped in the chaos with Mirth, but the other captives had been recaptured by the Corvith, who survived the crash. Now, the Corvith were searching the region for her, and Sithara knew that if they found her, they would take Mirth, and she would never see her daughter again. Yuna felt a cold anger building in her chest as she listened to Sethra's story through gestures and tears. How could anyone hunt another living being just to take their skin and sell it for money? It was the most evil thing she had ever heard, and it made her even more determined to protect Sithara and Mirth from the monsters who wanted to hurt them. She taught Sithara simple human words like food and water and safe and danger. Sithara taught her Valorian words in return, and Yuna practiced them until she could say friend and mother and child in a language from the stars. On the seventh day, Sithara did something that made Yuna cry, even though she tried very hard not to. The alien mother reached out and took Yuna's small hand in her own long, thin fingers. Her skin was cool to the touch and surprisingly soft, and Yuna could feel a faint pulse of warmth where the bioluminescent patterns ran beneath the surface. Sithara pressed Yuna's hand against her own chest where a heart would be in a human. Then she pressed her other hand against Yuna's chest in the same place. It was a Valorian gesture of deep gratitude and trust, a way of saying that their hearts were connected. Now Yuna understood that Sithara was thanking her not just for the food, but for seeing her as a person worthy of kindness. In a galaxy full of beings who wanted to hurt her and use her, this small human child had chosen to help without asking for anything in return. But as the days passed, Yuna knew that she could not keep this secret forever. She was running out of excuses for the missing food, and her grandmother was starting to notice how tired she looked from staying up late every night. And there was another problem that made Yuna's stomach twist with fear whenever she thought about it. Strange ships had been spotted flying over the mountains, ships that did not match any of the Galactic Concord vessels that sometimes passed through Earth's skies. The people in town were talking about unusual activity in the forest, about lights in the sky at night and sounds that did not belong to any earthly animal. Yuna knew that the Corvith were getting closer, narrowing their search for the escaped Valorian and her child. She could not protect Sithara alone anymore, no matter how much she wanted to. As she walked home through the darkening forest on the seventh evening, Yuna made a decision that scared her more than anything else in her young life. Tomorrow she would tell her grandmother everything and pray that Yunji would understand why she had done what she did. If her grandmother turned Sithara away or called the authorities, Yuna did not know what she would do, but she could not let Sithara and Mirith die because she was too afraid to ask for help. She looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky and whispered a wish to whoever might be listening. Please let my grandmother have a heart big enough to help a mother from the stars. The autumn wind carried the smell of pine and wet earth as Yuna walked through the forest behind her grandmother's farm, calling out for her lost goat with growing frustration in her voice. She had been searching for nearly an hour, and the sun was beginning to fall toward the mountains in the west, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of the persimmons drying on the farmhouse porch. at 12 years old. Yuna was used to doing chores alone since her grandmother Yunji was getting older and could not walk as far as she once did. The goat, a stubborn creature named Bori, had a habit of wandering off to find better grass and usually returned on his own before dark. But today, something felt different in the forest, and Yuna could not explain the strange feeling that made her skin prickle with awareness. 6 months had passed since the day the whole world changed forever when enormous ships descended from the sky, and beings from distant stars announced themselves. To humanity, the Galactic Concord, they called themselves, a union of dozens of alien species who had watched Earth for centuries, and finally decided that humans were ready to know the truth about the universe. Life in their small rural town had not changed much since first contact because the aliens mostly stayed in big cities and government buildings far away. But sometimes Yuna would look up at the night sky and wonder what it would be like to meet someone from another world. She pushed through a thick patch of bushes and stumbled into a small clearing, where an old hunting cabin stood with its wooden walls covered in moss and vines. Her grandfather had built this cabin many years ago before he passed away, and now it sat forgotten and abandoned at the edge of their property. Yuna was about to turn back and continue her search when she noticed something that made her heart stop beating for a single terrifying moment. There were tracks in the soft mud leading to the cabin door, but they were not the tracks of any animal she had ever seen. They were long and narrow, with 3 deep grooves that suggested feet very different from human ones. Every lesson about stranger danger that her grandmother had taught her screamed at Yuna to run home and tell an adult what she had found. But curiosity was a powerful force in the heart of a young girl who had spent her whole life wondering about the stars. She crept toward the cabin with careful steps, her worn shoes making almost no sound on the damp ground. The door hung open on rusted hinges, and through the gap she could see shadows moving in the dim light inside. Yuna held her breath and peered through the doorway, and what she saw would stay with her for the rest of her life. A figure lay curled on the floor of the cabin, tall and thin with limbs that seemed too long for a human body. The being's skin was pale gray like morning mist, and Yuna could see faint patterns running along its arms and neck that should have been glowing, but instead looked dark and lifeless. The alien wore torn clothing that might once have been beautiful, but now hung in dirty rags. Around its starving frame, Yuna could count every rib beneath the thin fabric, and she understood immediately that this creature was dying. Then she noticed what the alien was clutching against its chest with desperate strength, even in its weakened state. Small pod no bigger than a melon rested in the alien's arms, and through its transparent surface, Yuna could see a tiny form curled inside. The baby alien was even smaller than a human infant, with the same gray skin and the same dark patterns that should have been bright. The mother, for Yuna knew instantly that this was what the alien must be, lifted her head at the sound of Yuna's gasp. Her eyes were large and dark like pools of deep water, and they held more fear than Yuna had ever seen in any living creature. The alien tried to push herself backward, away from the human child in the doorway, but she was too weak to do more than tremble. A sound came from her throat that was not quite a word in any language Yuna knew, but the meaning was clear enough. Please do not hurt us. Please do not take my child. Please let us live. Yuna felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw terror in that sound, and at the sight of a mother so desperate to protect her baby. She had seen the same look in the eyes of the stray cat that gave birth under their porch last spring, ready to fight anything that threatened her kittens despite being half-starved herself. Without thinking about whether it was wise or safe, Yuna slowly knelt down and opened the small bag she carried over her shoulder. Inside was her lunch that she had not yet eaten. A container of rice with vegetables and a small piece of fish wrapped in cloth. She placed the food on the ground and pushed it gently toward the alien mother, then backed away with her hands held up to show she meant no harm. The alien stared at the offering with those enormous dark eyes, and Yuna could see her fighting between fear and desperate hunger. Finally, the need to survive won over the fear of the unknown. The alien reached out with a trembling hand and took the container of rice. Sniffing it carefully before taking a small bite, she chewed slowly, and Yuna watched the tension in her body ease just slightly as the food settled in her empty stomach. The baby in the pod stirred and made a tiny sound, and the mother immediately touched the transparent surface with gentle fingers. Yuna understood that gesture too, because it was the same thing any mother would do to comfort a crying child. She wanted to stay and help more, but the light was fading fast, and her grandmother would worry if she did not return home soon. Yuna pointed to herself and then pointed in the direction of the farm, trying to show that she would come back. She held up one hand with all 5 fingers spread wide, then closed it and opened it again. Tomorrow, she hoped the gesture said, "I will return tomorrow with more food." The alien watched her with those deep dark eyes, and Yuna thought she saw something like hope flicker in their depths as she turned to leave. Yuna heard a sound from behind her that was soft and musical, despite the weakness in the voice that made it. She looked back and saw the alien touching her own chest with one hand while the other still held her baby close. It was a gesture of gratitude. Yuna was certain of it, and it made her heart feel both heavy and light at the same time. She ran home, through the darkening forest with her mind racing, and her thoughts tumbling over each other like leaves in the wind. There was an alien in her grandfather's cabin, a mother with a baby who was starving and scared and completely alone. Yuna did not know how the alien had come to be there or why she was hiding in the woods instead of asking humans for help, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty as she burst through the back door of the farmhouse. She was going to help them survive, no matter what it took.